Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from the bunker. And in this video, we're going to be talking about evolution. Jehovah's Witnesses are known for promoting the idea that evolution is a false teaching and have produced many books, brochures, and videos over the decades to advance that claim. But what would an actual scientist make of this material? To answer that question, I've enlisted the help of a noted biologist and author of the book, Why Evolution is True. Dr. Jerry Coyne, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the channel.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So what we've done is we've chosen, for the purpose of argument, the two most recent brochures that Jehovah's Witnesses are currently distributing on the subject of evolution. In fact, I got this brochure actually outside the Natural History Museum, believe it or not, where it was being handed out. So I feel that these are good examples or very recent examples of the kind of anti-evolution material. There's going to be 5 quotes from each. Now, without further ado, let's get started on them. So the first quote is actually from the brochure, Was Life Created? It's from pages 14 and 15. It's rather a long quote, but just for the purpose of completeness, I'm going to read it all. Many researchers would attribute the seemingly ingenious designs evident in nature to millions of years of evolutionary trial and error. Other researchers, though, arrive at a different conclusion. Microbiologist Michael Baer wrote in the New York Times of February 7th, 2005, "The strong appearance of design in nature allows a disarmingly simple argument. If it looks, walks, and quacks like a duck, then absent compelling evidence to the contrary, we have warrant to conclude it's a duck." His opinion, design should not be overlooked simply because it's so obvious. Now, consider these facts. Highly trained researchers crudely mimic systems in nature to solve difficult engineering problems, yet some would attribute the genius of devising the original idea to unintelligent evolution. Does that sound reasonable to you? If the copy requires an intelligent designer, what about the original? Really, who deserves more credit, the master engineer or the apprentice who imitates his designs? Have you come across that argument before, Jerry?
Well, it's a very confused argument, I have to say. First they say, it has multiple parts. The first is, well, if things look designed, the obvious conclusion is they were designed. Okay, well, that was the way people thought before Charles Darwin came along, and he presented an alternative, a purely naturalistic alternative to design by an intelligent agent. And not only that, but it's an explanation which has stood up the test of time. The alternative that God made things, I guess, do the Jehovah's Witnesses call him Yahweh or God or Jehovah? Oh, Jehovah. Okay,
include in the name, Jerry.
Sorry. We call him Yahweh when I was So the alternative is Jehovah made these things, but there's no evidence for Jehovah, and yet we have every evidence for the step-by-step process for all the tenets of what Darwin said, and the evidence has become even stronger in the last 150 years, 160 years by now. So just saying that we conclude it's a design because it looks like it's design, that idea was overturned by Charles Darwin. Before his time, everybody thought there was no other explanation for things that look designed. Afterwards, he managed to convince all scientists and all thinking people that weren't religiously biased within 10 years that evolution was the correct explanation. The other part, that because some people use evolutionary algorithms to design things like drugs or to make neural networks or things like that, but that those algorithms were actually, conceived of by a human. I'm not sure what they're really saying here. What sounds reasonable? If the copy requires an intelligent designer, what about the original? And I'm not sure what they're really asking here. What does that mean? That the person that makes the program must have been created by Jehovah? I don't know. The fact is that we're doing in these algorithms exactly what natural selection does. We let things operate and we keep what works. and throw other stuff away. And you keep doing that over and over again, and you arrive at a system. Now, that takes human intelligence, but it's imitating something that's purely naturalistic. So neither of these things provide any evidence whatsoever for the existence of creation. I don't, it's a very confused question, and I'm surprised that people would even say something like this to the layperson, who would surely be even more confused than I.
It also raises the question: well, who created the creator? Who?
Yeah, I know.
If these things require a creator, then surely the creator requires a creator as well.
That's right. And the religious people's answer to that is the buck stops at the first creator. But that doesn't make any sense. I mean, where did, was he always been there? What was he doing before the creation? There's all these theological questions that are raised by that answer. So, religious people tend to laugh off that explanation, but it's a very good question. And, if you're going to say, well, the creator if buck stops with the creator, why can't you say the buck stops with the Big Bang and leave out the middleman?
Indeed. I think what it mostly boils down to, this whole issue with needing a designer and kind of complicated things requiring a designer is complexity. I think creationists struggle with the concept of complicated things arising through natural processes. But would it be fair to say that complexity isn't an argument against evolution?
Not really, because we've been able to attain it by either trying to create biochemical challenges to organisms in the lab. Now, granted, we cannot make a human being from a single cell in a laboratory experiment because it takes billions of years to do something like that. But we can mimic the process in two ways. We can try to challenge microbes, which grow very quickly, with novel chemicals and see what happens. And you can get quite complex solutions to those challenges, as Richard Lenski has found in his experiments. And the other way is to try to just say, okay, let's see how long it takes to make a complex thing using conservative assumptions and mathematical models. And so that's what they did with the eye. That's a paper by Prager and Nielsen called The Eye in a Twinkling. I think that, that's Richard Dawkins' article about it. But what they did was they started with a light-sensitive eye spot, like you're found in flatworms. And they, just by making random mutations at about the rate that mutations occur, assuming that a small proportion of those are adaptive, that is, they improve the light sensitivity or the acuity of the eye, and then letting it run and seeing how long it takes. And they got something that was just like a camera eye, much more complex than a light-sensitive eye spot, something like what we have and what octopi have, within 86,000 generations, which is like that's why Richard called his article The Eye in a Twinkling. Well, it's a double entendre, but that's 86,000 generations is nothing in evolutionary time. So there we can actually see the complexity evolving. We can't do this in the lab because it takes so long. There's no organism where you could actually evolve a light-sensitive eye spot into an eye within the lifetime of an investigator, but we can model it. And lo and behold, you see that this kind of complexity can arise relatively quickly. I think the failure of people to appreciate this comes from two things: the failure of their imagination, that if you put one good thing on top of another one, then eventually you're going to get something that is a big improvement, and that improvement can be, but not always is, more complex than what was there in the first place. Indeed. And second of all, it's the failure to appreciate how long evolutionary time has been. I mean, life has been on Earth probably about 4 billion years, and that's 4 times 10 to the 9th, or 4,000 million years. And remember, the light spot is only 86,000 years to get an eye. So, there's no problem either in people's minds, of the evolutionists' minds, or in mathematical calculations to account for the evolution of complexity.
Indeed. Well, I think you've well and truly answered that particular point. So we'll move on to the next one. I'm mindful, of course, that your time is fairly limited. The second quote is from page 20. After examining the evidence, Lernig concluded mutations cannot transform an original species of plant or animal into an entirely new one, This conclusion agrees with all the experiences and results of mutation research of the 20th century taken together, as well as with the laws of probability. So can mutations cause one species to evolve into a completely new kind of creature? The evidence answers no. Lernig's research has led him to the conclusion that properly defined species have real boundaries that cannot be abolished or transgressed by accidental mutations. Consider the implications of the above facts. If highly trained scientists are unable to produce new species by artificially inducing and selecting favorable mutations, is it likely that an unintelligent process would do a better job? If research shows that mutations cannot transform an original species into an entirely new one, then how exactly was macroevolution supposed to have taken place? Jerry.
Yeah, here we have another thicket to chop our way through. Yeah, this is my field of expertise, speciation, and we define species in evolution as different species are members of groups of organisms that cannot exchange genes between the groups. So if they hybridize, the hybrids are sterile, or they might not want to mate with each other, or they could live in different places, or they could be in mating condition at different times. All these factors, which we call reproductive barriers, are things that define members of different species. And things that are members of the same species have the potential to exchange genes and produce hybrids that are fertile with anybody else. So humans, for example, are all members of Homo sapiens, because you could take any human, mate it with any other human, I mean, if they're of different sexes, and you'll get an offspring, and the offspring will be fertile. We're not members of the species of chimps, Pan-troglodytes, for example, because we cannot exchange genes with chimps. I mean, people have tried that, not in the salacious way, but they've injected female chimpanzees with sperm from human males, and nothing happens. You don't get a fertilized egg. There are numerous physiological barriers, not to mention the fact that we don't want to copulate with chimps, and they don't want to copulate with us, which is a behavioral barrier that's evolved as well. So that's what we mean by species. Most people think of different species as things that look different, but that's a very arbitrary criterion in biology, because you don't know how different they have to look before it was, whereas the reproductive barriers actually define something that's real. Okay, so that's what we think of as species. Now, this guy says, or Lornig, whoever that Lornig is, says, if highly trained scientists are unable to produce new species by artificially inducing and selecting favorable mutations, is it likely that an unintelligent process would do a better job? First of all, that's wrong. Scientists have produced new species by a variety of methods. I could take 2 strains of fruit flies, and by putting the right mutations in them, make them unable to mate with each other, but able to mate with others of their kind. So, you know, I've done that, and people have done that. Second of all, you can do it in the lab with plants. You just double the chromosome number of a plant, and lo and behold, it cannot exchange genes with its ancestor, because the hybrids will have 3 sets of chromosomes instead of 2, and they're called triploids, like bananas, and they'll be sterile. Bananas are sterile because they're made this way, and if you cut through a banana and there's black seeds in the middle, those are the aborted seeds of the sterile hybrid trying to form seeds. So, you know, I mean, you could say that the domestic banana is an artificially created species. I mean, this has happened over and over again throughout the history of life in plants, and we can reproduce it exactly in the laboratory. So, you know, and so if you define species by reproductive barriers, A, we can make them. B, we can make them without much trouble, especially in plants. And C, we've seen them form in nature in a human lifetime. That we've seen, for example, a new species of marsh grass form in England within 50 years this way. It's a new species. Now, if you're looking for simply, if you define species as things that look real different, which is probably what Lornig is saying, although he does not give his species definition here, then the problem is even lessened, because we can make an arbitrarily different degree of difference by artificial selection in almost anything. Consider that the broccoli, kohlrabi, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, all those vegetables are members of the same species. And if you found these fossilized, you would say, well, they're not just different species, they're different genera or even different families. And yet that has been arrived by scientists, horticulturists, selecting different mutations in the way nature has. Look at the breeds of dogs. I mean, I think it's likely that if you put a pen of Chihuahuas together with a pen of Great Danes, and they're all considered, Canis familiaris, the domestic dog.
The Great Danes would basically have a big dinner, I think.
Yeah, but in terms of mating with each other, I don't think they'd be able to, So you could consider, that all the dogs form a chain where a Great Dane can mate with Saint Bernard, and he can mate with, a Spaniel and so and so. That if you just take the endpoints, like a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, you put them together in a pen, they remain distinct indefinitely. Those are, you call them species. Or if these dogs were fossilized, and you saw a fossil Great Dane and you saw a fossil Chihuahua, and that's all we had. Every zoologist would say these are different species, if not different genera or different orders or whatever. So there's no saying that there are limits, so there are arbitrary limits to how far evolution can go before you get either a certain amount of difference in appearance or a certain reproductive barrier. There's no basis for that whatsoever. And,
I regularly hear from creationists or people who support the creation narrative on my channel who say, yes, I'm on board with microevolution, but not macroevolution. What would you say to people who say that?
Well, there's two ways to respond to that. So the way I'd respond to that first would be to say, well, you have to be on board with macroevolution because it's in the fossil record. We can trace a continuous series of fossils from fish to amphibians, from amphibians to reptiles, from reptiles to birds on the one hand and mammals on the other. In fact, we have in the fossil record things that are so intermediate between reptiles and mammals and occurring right after the reptiles are formed, but before we see well-formed mammals. They're so intermediate that zoologists can't decide which group to put them in. So they're called mammal-like reptiles, but you could easily call them reptile-like mammals. And we have intermediates between early ape-like creatures, well, we are apes, but things that are more ape-like and humans. So we have intermediates between whales and terrestrial organisms like deer that are only about 2 feet tall. So we see this evolutionary change happening in the fossils. So how can you deny macroevolution? Okay, that would be my first response, that it happens and we see it. So, what are you going to say? Now, somebody like Michael Behe will say, okay, I'll grant you that. We have this common ancestry, we have these big changes, but God or Jehovah had to step in at certain points to cross these borders, But if we can make changes that are so large just by artificial selection without the need for God, I mean, you could say we're playing God, but all we're doing is finding random mutations and accumulating them the same way natural selection does. Then where are these limits? Where are the barriers where God has to step in order to transcend them? So Behe has not convinced anybody. That's the tack he takes in his latest book, that evolution can occur below, I think, the family level. You could get new genera and new species. And Homo sapiens, Homo is the genus, sapiens is a species. So we're in Homo with all our other extinct ancestors. You can get changes within a genus by evolution, but to go from genera to families, the next step up, you need God. And that's just completely silly. I mean, we don't know of any mutations that are necessary for God to make. There's no evidence that mutations are engineered by divine providence, they just seem to happen randomly, and most of them are bad. So,
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, the biggest evidence against macroevolution is the fossil record, which amply documents these huge changes over millions of years.
As we will get into. So thank you for answering there, Jerry. Quote number 3. So does natural selection really create entirely new species? Decades ago, evolutionary biologist George Christopher Williams began questioning whether natural selection had such power. In 1999, evolutionary theorist Jeffrey Schwartz wrote that natural selection may be helping species adapt to the changing demands of existence, but it is not creating anything new. Indeed, Darwin's finches are not becoming anything new. They are still finches, and the fact that they are interbreeding casts doubt on the method some evolutionists use to define a species. In addition, information about these birds exposes the fact that even prestigious scientific academies are not above reporting evidence in a biased manner.
He doesn't define what he means by something new. He says they're still finches, but when Darwin looked at these finches, he didn't think they were finches. He thought they were nightingales because they were so aberrant, and yet they were created by natural selection. And if you look at these finches, they're hugely different from one another. Some of them have big, fat beaks to crack seeds. One of them uses cactus spines like a woodpecker. It's called the woodpecker finch to pick insects out of trees. We have vampire finches that peck into other animals and drink the blood. I mean, is that not new? What he means is you haven't seen a finch turn into a primate. Well, you can't, we don't have the time in our lifetime to see that happen, but we can see transformations that big happening in the fossil record. So, this is a very common argument that doesn't create something new, but they never define what new is. If we're talking about new ways of life, new appearances, new behaviors, that's all seen in Darwin's finches. So you can say, yeah, they're all finches, but the fact that they're all finches didn't impress Charles Darwin when he thought they were so different from the finches that were elsewhere in the world that he thought they're nightingales or something like that. And it took ornithologist John Gould to correct him on that. So, I don't know what that means about prestigious scientific academies reporting evidence in a biased manner. I won't even touch that one without knowing more about what he's talking about.
Yeah, that was a little bit dubious. And they're not really in a position to be talking about reporting evidence in a biased manner, because in this very brochure, I need to cover this in a separate video, but these brochures are basically strewn with misquotes. So it's a pot kettle black scenario anyway. But perhaps if we move on to the next quote, Niles Eldredge, a staunch evolutionist, states that the fossil record shows not that there is a gradual accumulation of change, but that for long periods of time, little or no evolutionary change accumulates in most species. To date, scientists worldwide have unearthed and catalogued some 200 million large fossils and billions of small fossils. Many researchers agree that this vast and detailed record shows that all the major groups of animals appeared suddenly and remained virtually unchanged, with many species disappearing as suddenly as they arrived. Did all the species more or less arrive at the same time?
Well, no, that's not true either. I mean, this comes from punctuated equilibrium, which was a theory that Gould and Eldredge proposed, that evolutionary change is always very rapid and jerky, and most of the time nothing's happening, and all of a sudden you get a big leap. And so in the fossil record, all of a sudden they were evolutionists. All they said is that the change happens so rapidly and in such small populations that we can't see it. They didn't say that God or Jehovah made this change. So to say that Eldredge is somehow buttressing creationism here is completely bogus. I mean, they were straight evolutionists. But the fact is that, yeah, for many fossils, particularly marine microfossils, the fossil record is jerky. And that's what you'd expect if things are pretty well adapted to their environment, and all of a sudden the environment changes rapidly, like we have global warming or global cooling, has happened repeatedly over the history of life. So then you'll get a period of rapid change. Sometimes it's so rapid that you can't see it in the fossil record. Remember, though, the fossil record is a very, very imperfect window of life. I mean, the coelacanths were thought to be extinct for hundreds of millions of years, and then they appeared. Then we found them in the 1930s. Well, obviously they were there the whole time, but the fossil record didn't preserve them. So that's one thing. The other thing is to say that major groups appear suddenly and appear and unchanged. I just said when I was contesting macroevolution that we can see in the fossil record the origin of major groups: amphibians, reptiles, birds. We have a very good fossil record of birds, starting with things that are like theropod dinosaurs and changing as we get more recent time to have little feathers on them, bigger feathers. They lose their hand bones, they lose their teeth, they lose their tail. And we can see this happening. I mean, it's not a sudden thing. It takes millions of years. And same thing with the origin of reptiles, same thing for the origin of amphibians, same thing for the origin of humans. I mean, when you look at the human record, you don't see modern Homo sapiens appearing suddenly. You go back 6 million years, you see something that's very like, chimpanzee-like, with a small brain case, large teeth, knuckle walking or arboreal. And then the more you get to the modern fossil record, the more and more things look like modern humans. Well, if anything is novel to a religionist, it is Homo sapiens, right? And yet we have a largely unbroken series of fossils that traces our appearance back to something that's very like, a gorilla or a chimpanzee. So it's just wrong to say that major groups appear suddenly. Sometimes they do, like rabbits, for example. We don't have a good fossil record of rabbits. And until recently, turtles also seem to appear suddenly in the fossil record. Well, that, all that what betoken was that we didn't have a very good window on the fossil record, because most 99.9% of organisms or species are not fossilized. They just don't, because you have to be washed into the sediments and covered with dirt and subject to pressure. Then you have to be exposed to the upper layers of the strata. So, but then we found a half turtle not that long ago, within the last decade. So there went that theory out the window that turtles came from nowhere. So as science progresses, these lacunae get filled in over time, and what happens is the idea that major groups originate suddenly is, what they mean by suddenly here is instantaneously, because they're touting creationism. Well, that's just crazy. I mean,
suddenly in geological terms is a long time, I would imagine.
Be millions of years, because for some groups the fossil strata aren't laid down for millions of years, so there's no possibility of seeing those intermediates happening. But we have a good enough fossil record that we have lots of cases, not only of single species changing gradually over time. I have my book, I just happen to have it here, Why Evolution is True, gives some examples of that kind of change. But we also see new groups originating and splitting off from other groups. So we have the theropod dinosaurs splitting from the other dinosaurs, and the theropods evolving into birds. Dinosaurs went extinct. It is true what he says, that many species disappear as suddenly as they arrive, but that's because extinction is a lot faster than evolution. If the world changes so quickly that you freeze to death and every member of your species dies, or it burns to death, which is what's happening for many species now, then you disappear quite suddenly. So that doesn't mean that God made things appear suddenly. So.
Indeed. So we're on to our final quote of the Was Life Created brochure, and I have tried to pick the most persuasive or the most kind of compelling quotes from the brochure. But I would, by all means, if you want to check these brochures out yourself, you can find them very easily on the jw.org website. It says, if you are to accept the teaching of macroevolution as true, you must believe that agnostic or atheist scientists like Jerry will not let their personal beliefs influence their interpretations of scientific findings. You must believe that mutations and natural selection produced all complex life forms, despite a century of research that shows that mutations have not transformed even one properly defined species into something entirely new. You must believe that all creatures gradually evolved from a common ancestor, despite a fossil record that strongly indicates that the major kinds of plants and animals appeared abruptly and did not evolve into other kinds, even over eons of time. Does that type of belief sound as though it is based on facts or on myths? Really, belief in evolution is an act of faith. Jerry.
I can dispose of that quite quickly. I mean, this is basically what comes out of the south end of a cow facing north. It's the old canard that science is based on faith. But evolution, if you look at even the history of evolution, or how evolutionists or scientists operate today, it's not based on faith. Remember that Darwin's theory was introduced into a religious milieu in 1859, and everybody thought that design was there because Jehovah or God or whoever your deity is created it. It was the evidence that Darwin gave. And back then, we didn't have a fossil record. Darwin convinced everybody that evolution occurred without having a fossil record, which you can do, but the fossils just are the icing on the cake. So within, as I said, 10 years of the origin of species, by 1869, 1870, virtually every thinking person in Britain had accepted evolution, even though they were religious. So, it is not the fact that, what is it that would make somebody who is religious suddenly accept evolution when they're still religious? You can't be that you're wedded to evolution because you're an atheist or an agnostic, because back then most people were not. Now, Darwin was probably a deist at best, maybe an agnostic, maybe an atheist, but a lot of people who accepted evolution back then and who accepted evolution now are religious. It's not faith in a religious sense is belief that is not buttressed by evidence strong enough to convince people that it's true. So Christians have one kind of faith, Jehovah's Witnesses, which I guess are considered Christians of a sort, have another subset of that faith. Jews have another one, Muslims have another one, but you can't adjudicate that. There's no evidence that's going to tell you whether God is Yahweh or Allah or Buddha or Vishnu or something like that. That's religious faith. There's no faith in science like that. It's only evidence, and enough evidence to convince people that, something is true, and then convince people that evolution is true. So I was just in India a year from last Christmas, and this is different a place from the United States culturally and religiously as you can get, and yet I toured the universities and we were on common ground with evolution because we all knew what the evidence was and we all agreed on it. I mean, that's not faith. That's like saying, well, is this phone black or not? It's something you agree on. So there's two things. First of all, that you have to make a distinction between faith and religion and the kind of confidence that scientists get based on evidence, because that's not faith. As Hebrews, I think it's Hebrews 1:11, faith is the belief in things that you cannot prove. I can't muster up the quote, but that's there's something like that. So, and second of all, there are so many religious scientists. In fact, probably about 50 to 60% of American scientists believe in God. So why do they accept evolution, right? It's not that they're wedded to some atheistic, agnostic paradigm. It's because they see that the evidence is dispositive. They can maintain their religious faith, but they don't deny evolution. So you must believe that agnostic or atheist scientists will not let their personal beliefs influence their interpretation of scientific findings. I don't know what that means in terms of you must believe this, you must believe that, you must believe that. No, we don't swear when we become evolutionists. We don't put our hand on a copy of Darwin and say, this is what I believe. We have been convinced in the last 150 years by the evidence.
So they're saying scientists are biased because they're all atheists, and you're saying, actually, at least in America, the majority of scientists are religious.
Correct. That's true. I think it's something like 50 to 60% actually. Now, as the higher you go up in the scientific echelon, until you get to the people in the National Academy, the very best scientists. This is also true for the Royal Society in Britain. Over 90% of them are atheists. So the better the scientists, the more atheistic they get. I think that's because, well, there's two possible reasons. The better scientist you are, the more wedded you are to the materialistic method, and you've suddenly realized that the belief in supernatural is untenable. Or it could be that people who have rejected religion from the very beginning tend to go further in science. But it's not true by any means that scientists are not religious. And in fact, until the beginning of the 20th century, all scientists were religious. And by that time, Darwinism had already been accepted by the scientific community.
And you would also contest where it says mutations have not transformed even one properly defined species into something entirely new.
Well, as I said, I could go into the lab and do this myself with fruit flies. And it depends on what you mean by new. There's no let's just say there's no conceptual, theoretical, or empirical barrier to showing this, and we've seen species transform themselves into something new in the fossil record, as well as in one human lifetime. So, this is just bluster.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, don't know biology.
Yeah. I surprise, the anti-science brochures spouting nonsense. We must move on to the next brochure now. This is now the Origin of Life brochure. Both of these brochures, by the way, published in 2010. And the first quote from this brochure is from page 12. The theory of evolution tries to account for the origin of life on Earth without the necessity of divine intervention. However, the more that scientists discover about life, the less likely it appears that it could arise by chance. To sidestep this dilemma, some evolutionary scientists would like to make a distinction between the theory of evolution and the question of the origin of life. But does that sound reasonable to you? The theory of evolution rests on the notion that a long series of fortunate accidents produced life to start with. It then proposes that another series of undirected accidents produced the astonishing diversity and complexity of all living things. However, if the foundation of the theory is missing, what happens to the other theories that are built on this assumption? Just as a skyscraper built without a foundation would collapse, a theory of evolution that cannot explain the origin of life will crumble. So, Jerry, is abiogenesis and evolution one and the same?
Well, people used to say, separate them like it says here, not because there's any conceptual difference, but just because it's so much harder to explain the origin of life than it is, because we have no fossil record back then, and we don't know how it happened. All we have is the end products of it. We're still making progress to that, but now more and more scientists are coming to accept that it is a continuous process of evolution, and the border between life and non-life is attained by the same kind of process that one species evolves into another. The origin of replicators, the proliferation of some replicators at the expense of others, the persistence of those replicators that are able to protect themselves from being eaten or destroyed by the environment. So there's a book by Addie Pross, published by Oxford University Press, that actually makes the point. The whole point of this book, I can't remember the name of it. I can actually look it up if you want. For the possibility of readers, I'll just Google it here, because it's a very good book. Pross is called What is Life? How Chemistry Becomes Biology. His point is that there is no threshold where life turns into non-life, and that the origin of life happens by the very same process that evolution happens, as I just explained. And he does it much better than I do, because he is sort of a biochemist from Israel. So no, they're one and the same. It's just we start with molecules, and those molecules perpetuate differentially, and that's natural selection. And they have a certain resistance to being destroyed, which is survival. And they have a certain propensity to replicate faster than others. That's reproduction. And eventually the process gets to something that everybody would define as life. You know, we don't have a good definition of life. Some people say it's replication. Some people say it's metabolism. Richard Dawkins defines life as that which is subject to natural selection, which would be those first replicating molecules. So, you know, no scientist worth his or her salt now would say that there's something that happens after life originated that didn't happen before life originated. It's a continual process of selection, and depending on your definition of life, these barriers are crossed one after another. Now, again, it's a hard problem. We can't say how life originated right now. We may never know how life originated because we weren't there. Some questions we simply can't answer. What did Julius Caesar have for dinner the night before he was assassinated? You know, we'll probably never know that, but that doesn't mean he didn't have dinner. You know? So, you know, we think that life originated and all living creatures are descended from the sort of last universal common ancestor, the LUCA. We have reasons for that. We all have the same genetic code. We all have the same handedness of our amino acids. They're L versus R amino acids. And I have predicted that within the lifetime of my students, we will have created in the laboratory under early Earth conditions something that you could define as life. When that happens, and that will happen, then you no longer can say it couldn't have happened naturally. You know, this is a prediction I'm making. Okay, I'll be dead when it's fulfilled, but I'm pretty confident it will be. When that barrier is crossed, and it's not by design, because we can already make life in the lab just by making DNA, synthesizing DNA and sticking it into a bacterial cell, and lo and behold, it becomes alive. What will happen is we'll create early Earth conditions and we'll get something life-like evolved. Then what are these people going to say? Now, the final thing I have to say about that is, no, the skyscraper won't crumble just because we don't understand the foundation. The foundation, by all accounts and purposes, was there. And at any rate, we know evolution is true. Whatever happened, it's just that we cannot see its very beginnings because it happened in molecules that weren't fossilized. And it's a difficult problem. But we know that once we started seeing things about 3.8 billion years ago, those first blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, then there's no doubt that evolution operated for the after that.
That's interesting, because my standard answer to this sort of thing would be, we know that evolution happens because we have evidence, multiple lines of evidence that it happens. Abiogenesis is something where there's a degree of uncertainty, so it's disingenuous to kind of lump the two together. It's quite conceivable that life does evolve, even if we don't know how the first life originated. You're saying, actually, we can kind of take some kind of ownership of abiogenesis as being more or less the same as evolution.
Yeah, and that's what Eddie Prost does in this book. And I think he does it quite successfully, because if you're going to get something like this as complex as even the earliest form of life, self-replicating molecules that have enzymes and stuff, from something that's completely organic molecules floating around somewhere, it's got to be through some kind of evolutionary process. It's got to be, because you have lots of things occurring, and some of them are more successful than others, So,
sure.
So I've changed about that. I used to tell my classes that, origin of life is not really part of evolutionary biology. But, we know that the major tenets of evolution are true from other evidence. Now I say, it's not separate from evolution. It occurred through the same kind of process of evolution. It's just hard to understand. Saying that, evolution is all wrong because we don't understand how it started is like saying that the evolution of mammals couldn't have happened because we don't know where rabbits came from. I mean, we know what they're related to, but we don't know what they look like, what the earliest rabbit looked like, because there's no fossil record, just like there's no fossil record of the first living forms. So
we haven't found any rabbits in the Precambrian yet.
Yeah, that's a classic thing that's supposed to refute evolution if you find them. And indeed, it would be a formidable problem if we found a lot of rabbits in the Precambrian. So.
Sure. I could have a time traveler rabbit, I guess. So the next quote is from page 21. Famous scientist Richard Feynman left this note on a blackboard shortly before his death. What I cannot create, I do not understand. His candid humility is refreshing, and his statement obviously true in the case of DNA. Scientists cannot create DNA with all its replication and transcription machinery, nor can they fully understand it. Yet some assert that they know that it all came about by undirected chance and accidents. Does the evidence that you have considered really support such a conclusion? What do you think? Where does the evidence lead? Imagine that you found a computer room in the heart of a factory. The computer is running a complex master program that directs all the workings of that factory. What is more, that program is constantly sending out instructions on how to build and maintain every machine there, and it is making copies of itself and proofreading them. What would that evidence lead you to conclude? That the computer and its program must have made themselves, or that they were produced by orderly, intelligent minds? Really, the evidence speaks for itself.
This is the argument from ignorance again, because we don't know how DNA evolved, and it is quite complex. How it works, that means that God must have done it. It doesn't speak for itself. What we have to say is the classic scientific response, we don't know. But if you say, the alternative is to say that Jehovah did it. Okay, then I'll say, okay, how do you know Jehovah did it? What is the evidence that Jehovah does it? What is the evidence for Jehovah's existence? If you can't even adduce the presence of the person or deity that's supposed to have designed DNA, why am I supposed to accept your claim that there's a supernatural being behind it? Science has progressed by ignoring the supernatural and finally by rejecting it, not by punting to God at every time. Think of all the advances in science that were overcome by ignoring the deities. Things like infectious disease, lightning, magnetism, all that stuff used to be thought to be supernatural phenomenon. And if you thought that like the Black Plague was due to God, which many people did, then you would stop investigating it, right? Back then, if a scientist had been around, they would have said, well, we don't know. Well, let's just start trying to figure out how it happened. In fact, that's how they figured it out, that it was caused by a bacillus that was carried by by fleas that lived on rats, you know. So the proper response when you don't understand something in science is, we don't understand, we're going to work on it, and we're going to use naturalistic methods to answer that question. You may not be able to do that because you don't have the tools, and the human mind can't fathom everything, but it's the only way we've ever progressed. We have never made any progress in understanding anything in science by saying a designer did it. I defy these people that make statements like this to say, well, tell me one phenomenon where you can say with some certainty that Jehovah had a hand in this, you know, and there isn't any. There's no such thing.
Is it, as a scientist, and as like a noted scientist and kind of a famous scientist even, is it kind of unsettling to see Richard Feynman, who's obviously now dead, kind of being quoted in a propaganda material that's kind of against evolution?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a quote that's taken out of context. I know I've heard that quote, but I think what he meant was, if I can't work it out with equations myself, I can't say I fully understand it. He was talking about physics, not biology, and not DNA and stuff like that. And by the way, Feynman accepted evolution. So, you know, he had enough, if he was a humble person, he still accepted where the evidence led. So.
Indeed. Okay, so next quote from page 23. Recent research continues to contradict Darwin's theory of common descent. For example, in 2009, an article in New Scientist magazine quoted evolutionary scientist Eric Baptiste as saying, "We have no evidence at all that the tree of life is a reality." The same article quotes evolutionary biologist Michael Rose as saying, "The tree of life is being politely buried. We all know that. What's less accepted is that our whole fundamental view of biology needs to change."
Yeah, well,
is the tree of life dead and buried?
Yeah, I remember that New Scientist article, and the reason in fact, they had a picture of a tree of life on the cover and the sign, "Darwin was wrong." And he said there is no tree of life, and that's, again, to use it polite, I won't use the cow analogy, but it's junk. What they meant in the New Scientist article was hype. We now know that sometimes genes will hop from one species to another because they're carried in bacteria or in viruses, or in transposable elements that jump, remnants of ancient viruses that instruct us. Like the human placenta is partly constructed out of ancient retroviruses. So sometimes things can hop or infect distant branches in the tree of life, but no evolutionist I know would say that invalidates the tree of life. We know that humans and gorillas and orangutans had a common ancestor, and chimps, and the order was human and chimps branched 6 million years ago, humans and gorillas about 10 million years ago, and then the common ancestor of humans, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans about 13 million years ago. Over and over again we know this. We know that birds came from theropod dinosaurs. The tree of life is the reality, both because we understand how branching occurs and because we see, if the tree of life wasn't a reality, we could not know what species were more closely related to anything else. It would be a complete mixture. Yeah, when we do DNA sequencing, we can reconstruct family trees that are very similar to the ones that were constructed just on the way organisms looked. And we already knew that we were most closely related to chimps long before we had the DNA to show that we were very most similar to chimps. So the idea of the tree of life is bogus is simply wrong. It's a distortion of the more recent finding that occasionally genes can hop from one branch to another. But in so hopping, they do not efface those branches. It's like if you took a cutting from one branch of a tree and you put it on another branch that was distant and it took. And that's saying, well, okay, the tree doesn't exist anymore because you have this graph that worked. Well, that's exactly what these people are saying, and it's all wrong. The tree of life is a reality, and it's supported by so much evidence from the fossil record, from DNA, from morphology, from the existence of dead genes, from the existence of vestigial organs, etc. I mean, whales still have vestigial pelvises. Sometimes a little tiny limb comes out. What does that say? Well, it says that they evolved from things that have 4 legs. And sure enough, if you go back in the fossil record, after you've seen this, because it was Darwin that pointed stuff like that, you see early whales that had much larger limbs. So, the tree of life has been instantiated many times in many ways.
Haven't they traced the nearest kind of land ancestor, the nearest land mammal of Wales to hippopotamuses?
Yeah, it's a hippopotamus, yeah. Although that wasn't their ancestor. Their
No.
ancestor was something like a muntjac, those sort of two little deer that are found in Southeast Asia.
I guess closest relative would be more accurate, would it?
Relative of the cetaceans is the hippopotamus. There's no doubt about that.
Sure. Okay, penultimate quote. A second, more serious challenge is the lack of proof that those transitional creatures in the fossil record are somehow related. Specimens placed in the series are often separated by what researchers estimate to be millions of years. Regarding the time spans that separate many of these fossils, zoologist Henry Gee says, the intervals of time that separate the fossils are so huge that we cannot say anything definite about their possible connection through ancestry and descent. Commenting on the fossils of fish and amphibians, biologist Malcolm Gordon states that the fossils found represent only a small, possibly quite unrepresentative sample of the biodiversity that existed in these groups at those times. He further says, there is no way of knowing to what extent, if at all, those specific organisms were relevant to later developments or what their relationships might have been to each other. So, are transitional fossils a myth?
No, not at all. I mean, I've tried to emphasize throughout our conversation that we have series. I mean, just look at humans, for example. Yeah, we are not completely sure about our ancestry back to Australopithecus afarensis. But what we are sure of is that Australopithecus afarensis was, if not our direct ancestor, was something very like our direct ancestor. And we see this common series. They're not separated by millions of years, by the way. I mean, our common ancestor with the chimp is 6 million years old. We have how many species of hominins? Probably 20, 25 now. And we keep finding more of them. And we are able to trace their origins genetically, so we know about Neanderthals and when they came out of Africa, and when modern Homo sapiens came out of Africa and how we spread. Same thing with horses. I mean, we have almost continual series of horses in a single lineage, not separated by millions of years, separated by, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. So the idea that there are these huge gaps in the fossil record for every creature is again a lie. I mean, I can't say anything kinder than it is, less kind. Sorry, I mean, I do brand this a lie. These people are lying for Jehovah, in my opinion. They are so intent on maintaining their view, because Jehovah's Witnesses are creationists, that they will not accept scientific evidence, and they'll distort it every turn. And this is an example of such a distortion, that there are these huge gaps in the fossil record. Ask a paleontologist about the evolution of horses, the evolution of birds, the evolution of Homo sapiens. They'll tell you something very different.
I love the story of Tiktaalik, by the way, as evidence of a transitional fossil, because they actually predicted, if I'm right, where they would find it, in what kind of rock strata, depending on how old it would have needed to appear. And based on that, they projected what part of the world they'd need to dig in, and sure enough, they found it. And I can't think of a more obvious example of transitional fossils actually being both predicted and then found.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, what would a creationist say to that, I mean, you have something that's predicted and it's found. If everything was created at the same time, or there were successive creations, then you couldn't predict where the intermediates would be, because there would be no intermediates, first of all. But that's not the only instance of a successful evolutionary prediction. It's particularly striking because Neil Shubin used his undergraduate geology textbook to find the levels, where he should be digging, which was up in Canada, and found that. And he wrote a popular book about it, which is very good, Urine Fish. But there are other examples as well. Birds, for example, we didn't know the early birds. We knew when modern birds appeared, which was about 80 million years ago, and we knew when then dinosaurs appeared about 250 million years ago. So we predicted that if there was one evolved from the other, it would be somewhere in the middle of that period. Sure enough, when they started digging up these feathered dinosaurs, it was 125 million years old. it was 100 million years old, right in between. So, Tiktaalik's a striking example, but it's not the only example of a prediction fulfilled. And creationism simply cannot do that. Only evolution can make these kinds of predictions. That's one reason why people say that evolution is true. It makes predictions that are substantiated.
In fact, there's a good book by that title. So we're down to our final quote. It's a bit of a long one, so bear with me. And there's some odd pronunciation, which I'll try and battle through. Fact. At the beginning of the 20th century, all the fossils that were used to support the theory that humans and apes evolved from a common ancestor could fit on a billiard table. Since then, the number of fossils used to support that theory has increased. Now it is claimed that they would fill a railroad boxcar. However, the vast majority of those fossils consist only of single bones and isolated teeth. Complete skulls, let alone complete skeletons, are rare. Question: has the increased number of fossils attributed to the human family tree settled the question among evolutionary experts as to when and how humans evolved from ape-like creatures? Answer: no. In fact, the opposite is true. When it comes to how these fossils should be classified, Robin Dericourt of the University of New South Wales, Australia, wrote in 2009, perhaps the only consensus now is that there is no consensus. In 2007, the science journal Nature published an article by the discoverers of another claimed link in the evolutionary tree, saying that nothing is known about when or how the human line actually emerged from that of apes. Gyula Gienis, a researcher at the Department of Biological Anthropology, Ötvös Loránd University, Hungary, wrote in 2002, the classification and the evolutionary place of hominid fossils has been under constant debate. This author also states that the fossil evidence gathered so far brings us no closer to knowing exactly when, where, or how humans evolved from ape-like creatures. So is it a myth that humans evolved from ape-like creatures?
No, of course not. First of all, we have molecular dating now that we have the DNA, so we can tell that we diverged from chimpanzees from the common ancestor of chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. And sure enough, if we go back 6 million years, we find early things that look like they're going on to the human line. We find Australopithecines about 4 million years ago. Those are clearly on the human side of that split. We have a skeleton of Lucy that's 60% complete. True that we have bones and teeth and stuff, but people are underestimating the amount of information you can get out of bones and the DNA information now. So it's we can have this paleo DNA, which has enabled us to say that the Neanderthals bred with modern Homo sapiens, for example, and that they're bred with the Denisovans and things like that. So the fact that most of the fossils consist of single bones and isolated teeth. It's not isolated. I mean, there are whole troves of these things. Granted, we don't find complete human skeletons or hominin skeletons very readily. And it is also true that we cannot make a complete family tree of modern Homo sapiens tracing back through Australopithecus afarensis. But we do know that there were species on our side of that split, the robust Australopithecines, for example. It used to be called Zinjanthropus bosei and things like that went extinct. So we know that we have relatives that are not here anymore. And we know that we have relatives that might have been the source of modern humans. And it's just a matter of waiting until the evidence accumulates. But to say that we're not getting any closer to things is crazy. We now know when we split from the chimps. We didn't know that 100 years ago. We know where we evolved, which was in Africa, and we know when modern Homo sapiens evolved, which is about 200,000 years ago in West Africa. We know when that we had Neanderthal branch that was separate from ours that went to Europe, and then we came out later and they interbred with each other. I mean, this is all a fantastic increase in knowledge above what we had before. So I'm not sure what they're kvetching about here. It's a hard problem because humans were not as numerous as mollusks, for example. And they're not preserved so easily because they're not washed into water so easily. Sometimes they're found in caves, though. But every week, I mean, Steve Gould used to say when he gave his lecture on human evolution every year, he would start by throwing all his notes from the previous year into the wastebasket and going all over again. That's how fast knowledge of human evolution is accumulating. So, there are many mysteries. What happened to Homo erectus, for example? How did the Neanderthals really go extinct? By interbreeding? Did they just die out? Did we kill them? Or is there something they couldn't adapt to? We don't know that. And we may never know that. But sure as hell, you cannot deny that we're making progress in understanding human evolution. So again, we see a complete distortion. These people never, in all these quotes you gave me, they never give their alternative theory. This is a method of trying to ascertain truth by criticizing evolution, when we know what their truth is. Their truth is that God made everything at one time, but they're not going to say that. In fact, they haven't said that in this whole series of questions you've shown me.
Well, I've left that part out to the end, that there's a rather kind of dreary, like, for example, in this brochure, the final part is it reasonable to believe the Bible? And then it gives their side. But you're right, that the alternative, I guess, is humans at least popped into existence 6,000 years ago in the Garden of Eden because the Bible says so, and that's not really a legitimate grounds for making such a claim, is it?
Yeah, I know, especially because we have things that look very much like modern Homo sapiens over 100,000 years old. That alone disproves that hypothesis, unless you're willing to attack radiometric dating, which they
do, by the way. They do attack that.
Yeah, okay, but that's undermining established science very well. I mean, it's undermining established science in the service of religion. So the fact is, these people already know how things happen because it's in the Bible. And so all they can do in the face of this accumulating scientific evidence for evolution is to try to knock it down. And they do that by lying about it, by taking quotes out of context, by saying there are no evolutionary trees, that we have no transitional fossils. All of that is wrong. And all of that would be criticized by religious scientists working throughout the world on evolutionary biology. It's just sad. It's sad how people ignore the truth because it goes against their supernatural beliefs. That's what I find. Because the real story of evolution is so much richer and so much more detailed than Genesis 1 and 2, that to reject that whole tapestry of life in favor of two chapters in the Bible is really, really sad to me. And for children to not be exposed to at least the ideas of evolution and the evidence for it, they don't have to accept it. Nobody's forcing them to, but to not learn it and let them make up their minds themselves, to try to hide it with false quotes and lies about evolution, to me, that's just ineffably sad.
Well, it is sad, Jerry, but what is encouraging is that you've taken the time to use your knowledge and use your experience to debunk a lot of this nonsense. And I'm confident that a lot of the viewers watching this will have found your insights extremely helpful, because these are brochures that if you encounter Jehovah's Witnesses in the street stood by their carts, there's a good chance you're going to see these brochures. Certainly if you go to the Natural History Museum in London, you'll usually see these brochures outside. And yet now there's a video on YouTube with an actual biologist debunking the nonsense inside. And I'm really grateful to you for setting aside the time to do that.
That's my pleasure. I hope some people, I know that the hardcore religionists are not going to change their mind by listening to me. They'll just say, oh, he's an atheistic scientist. But there are people, open-minded people in every faith. And I'm just, the reason I came on your show was not to try to convert the diehards, because they're inconvertible, but to tell people who entertain some doubt, who may have an open mind, who are willing to listen to evidence, that evidence is out there, and it's accepted by scientists and accepted by most religious people who are not wedded to the creation story.
Well, I certainly appreciate you making that effort, and thank you so much for joining me.
Sure, my pleasure.
So viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I know I have. Please don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you so much for watching.